Have you ever felt completely unheard in your conversation? Like no matter what you said, the other person just didn't get it, didn't even hear you. Or maybe you've struggled to truly hear your partner without getting defensive. In this episode, we're breaking down why listening is so hard, why it is an act of love, and the one mindset shift that can change everything. Stick with us to the end because this could transform the way you communicate in your relationship. Coming up next on Master Your Marriage. Welcome to another episode. This is the third episode in our series of improving communication with your partner.
Yeah, last week's episode was so good. I got some really great feedback. I had someone tell me just today that is like the biggest game changer for them in their relationship, just last week's episode. So hopefully you guys got a chance to hear that. So far in this series, this has been a series all on improving communication. So far we've covered the first two critical aspects of communication. And that was in episode 1. We focused in that episode on how to really prepare ourselves for having tough conversations, which meant getting calm, self-confronting, challenging our stories that we tend to approach our partner with.
Challenging your stories is the hard part. Yeah, absolutely.
And then in episode 2, we walked through the 8 steps of speaking effectively. This was so good, showing you guys exactly how to communicate from the best in us, from the wisest part of ourselves, rather than from a place of blame or defensiveness or from our adaptive child.
Yeah. But even with all of that, the hardest and most important skill in communication isn't speaking. It's actually listening, and listening with compassion, I would say.
Listening.
Yeah.
Ooh, listening. That's probably the most important relationship skill.
Yeah. So as Charla mentioned, this skill, the listening part, is super important, yet it's the hardest one to do. Maybe well, I think we can listen, but do we listen well? Do you listen to what your partner says?
Well, I'm trying to get better at that.
Yeah, I am too. Yeah.
You know, of course, it's easy to listen when you're hearing praise, right?
Yep.
When you're hearing appreciation, when you're getting validation.
My favorite
it's
time.
Like, oh yeah, tell me how kind I am, how beautiful I am, how intelligent I am.
Well, we're tuned for that though, right?
And I can listen to that all day long.
Yeah. We're tuned to listen to that. Yeah.
But it's easy.
Yeah. Well, what if I were to tell you were selfish?
Well, now tell me that I'm selfish or inconsiderate or harsh. Well, then that's going to be a very different story, isn't it?
Who wants to hear that?
So when your partner comes to you and they say, hey, you know what? Here's a problem.
Ooh.
And here's how I see it.
That's a lot like, honey, we got to talk.
And here's how I think that you're contributing to this problem. Well, that is very different, isn't it? That's really hard to stay calm, to be able to settle your nervous system down, to be able to resist that urge to go straight into defensive mode.
Yeah, the 3-year-old wants to come out. And when you do get defensive, that's where we go into this limbic reaction, which is the fight or flight, right? And that becomes contagious.
Super contagious.
Right. I go back into my lizard brain, which is this just autonomic response, right? And then suddenly you have two people that are stuck in this fight or fight, and they're just reacting instead of listening. And at that point, neither of you is operating from a mature, let's say, adult perspective, right? No one's looking out for the relationship. Everyone's just looking out for themselves.
Exactly. But to truly listen, it really is difficult. We have to become both humble to be able to hear.
Yep.
And we have to be so very, very wise in making sure that we're staying in our mature prefrontal cortex.
Yeah. I mean, the wise part is not reacting, right?
We have to be able to quiet our impulses, and we have to be able to temporarily set aside our own viewpoint for a moment.
So hard.
Back in, I think it was like 1936, F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote a quote that, has been retold many times, but it's a quote I really love. And he said, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in the mind at the same time and still be able to retain the ability to function.
That's an old quote, but so good. So
right?
Good, right?
And since then, so many people have reworded it, but the truth remains the same, that only the wisest, I think, among us can hold two seemingly contradictory ideas at once. And yet, what's interesting is that when we do, we often realize that those viewpoints weren't actually so contradictory to begin with.
Yeah, when we're wise.
They were actually just two sides of the same truth.
Oh,
right?
Wow. often this is exactly what happens sort of in marital conflict. Your partner holds certain truths, certain things that they see that you may not be able to see or observe in the moment. And if you want to start solving your relationship problems, you have to bring more truth into your communication. And that is about seeing more truth in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
What am I willing to see? And oftentimes it's up to your partner to share that truth with you, because you're not going to see it.
Carl Jung actually once said, and I think this applies here, is that knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people.
Ooh.
He said the most terrifying thing is to be able to accept one's self completely. And when he said that, what he's saying is that we have to look where we least want to look, where it's the hardest to look, which of course is within ourselves.
And of course, the people closest to us, our partners and our children, they really see through us. They see us more clearly than we see ourselves. They see through our justifications. They notice our self-deception, and they witness how we react when the pressure is on. And I remember my kids, when they were younger, they could tell. They were just like, uh-oh. And I'm like, I'm not even that mad yet. But they knew, right? They knew that I was going to regress and not be the best parent, that I could have, right? In many ways, your partner can map those parts of you and simply share them with you in a way that you can't map yourself.
Exactly.
Right? They know you, just like that story I told you about my kids, right? They know me. They know what's going to happen next, even before I do, probably because I slipped back into my limbic system and I wasn't really thinking, right?
Right. Now, does that mean that their perspective is always perfect, that it's always accurate? No, not necessarily. Of course, we all have our biases, and so does our partner. They have a bias. They have their own wounds that they filter information through. They have, at times, their regressive mind and with their own agendas, but they also have the ability to see things about you that you might be blind to.
I'm going to throw in a story here. Right. I was raised with a lot of yelling and a lot of turmoil, and Charla was as well. But Charla's perception of that was that things were about to go bad. So early on in our marriage, I would get frustrated and I'd like slam a hammer down or something if I'm working in the backyard. Mm-hmm. But Charla would see that in a completely different way. Yeah, she saw that as a flaw, that she saw that as me not being able to manage my temper. But because of her experiences and her old wounds, she also saw that as a fatal flaw in the relationship.
True.
Right. And I had to challenge myself, like, do I really need to lose control? Right.
That's a very good point. But even though we do have these filters that that your partner is applying to the situation, they also at the same time do see things in you that you're blind to.
Yeah, without a doubt. So back to that example that I just shared about us, right? So I didn't think there was anything wrong with my actions. You pointed it out because you were concerned, and I had to consider that and say, okay, what would a rational person think about me, throwing my hammer down in the backyard because I was upset? Like, do I need to do that, or is there a better way for me to channel that? So that feedback, I had to challenge my own understanding of what that was. Charlotte, in this instance, shared with me, she says, this is what you look like when you do that. Do you want to look like that? I'm like, well, no, I don't want to look like an idiot who's, throwing a tantrum in the backyard like a 3-year-old, because I was, right? So I challenged that perception of myself and said, okay, where do I need to make changes? Yeah. So sort of that whole situation. So what is listening? Is it sitting there quietly waiting for your turn to talk? Is it mentally refuting everything your partner says while you're mentally preparing your defense? No. Listening is about being humble enough to hear things that might crush your ego, much like Charlotte telling me I was throwing a temper tantrum, right? It's about having the courage to be curious and ask yourself, what is her point of view, right? How did she, the person I love, arrive at this conclusion? And what does the world look like? And what do I look like through her eyes?
I like that. So listening is, again, it's the ability to hold two potentially what seems like contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time, your perspective and your partner's perspective.
Absolutely.
Without, and this is the hard part, without immediately trying to reference or go back to your own perspective.
Right. And just getting defensive automatically, right? And the goal isn't to explain your side with greater clarity. Like, no, you don't understand why
But let me just explain a
being
little bit
an idiot,
further.
Right?
You're just not getting me.
Yeah, you don't understand that, right? the goal is to truly understand how your partner sees things, how they see the thing that they shared with you.
Well, so since Robert shared a story, I'll share one real quick.
Oh, okay.
So I was thinking about this morning. There was this time when Robert also gave me feedback. And at the time he gave me this feedback, I really thought he must have just seen me incorrectly. Like, no. Like
I'm waiting for this story.
You definitely did not see me correctly. That is definitely not how I was. And so, as I asked more questions, and I think maybe we were at a place where I was able to ask questions, clarify, like, okay, explain to me how you really saw this, and trying to like see it through your perspective, that I started to realize, oh my gosh, I never really saw myself that way. I really never thought about it that way. I guess actually I was being a little bit inconsiderate or a little bit selfish in this situation. And at first, my initial reaction was, there's just no way. You must have misheard me. You must have misinterpreted what I was doing or saying, because there's no way that I was doing what you thought that I was doing.
Uh-huh.
So, our partner really is that mirror for us to be able to see those things that I could not see in that moment.
Right. I mean, and we all have our blind spots, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So other than helping us see more truth, maybe, why is listening such an important skill?
Yeah.
Why? Tell us, dig into this.
So last weekend, we were actually speaking at an event. And during the break, I actually had a woman, I think this will answer your question. I had this woman come up to me during the break, and she was pretty emotional. She was kind of shaken. She had actually just ended a 10-year relationship. And so she had come to the event by herself. She was, I think, one of the few people in the room who came without a partner. And she told me in the break, she said, I just never felt like I was ever known in my relationship.
Yeah.
Anytime I tried to express my perspective or my ideas or share my side of things, my partner would always counter with, that's not what happened. That's not right. That's not accurate. You've got this wrong. And she said, it was interesting because I didn't need my position to be right. I didn't need him to say, you're right, you're right, you're right. Or I didn't even really need him to validate me. I just wanted desperately to feel like I'd actually been heard for once. I wanted him to love me enough, to care about me enough, to just even try to understand my experience. And I think that really answers the question that you just asked. And it hit me that it really is true that listening is an act of love. So going back to the question you asked, why, other than seeing truth, I think it's an act of love.
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it can be, especially for people who want to be heard. And one of the things we work with a lot in the medical practice area that we're in is just hearing people out, because they don't get to people just want to be heard.
Everyone wants to be heard.
Right.
Yeah.
And while this is not easy, right? Listening to feedback, right? And we'll talk more in a moment about why that's so challenging. But at its core, listening is one of the most powerful ways to show someone that they're important to you, that they matter to you. It says, I care enough about you to hear you, even if I don't necessarily agree with it.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Another reason listening is such an effective act of love is that it gives the other person space to process their thoughts.
Oh, this is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People think and process information differently. And some of us are internal processors.
That's me.
Like they need quiet time alone to sort of sort through their thoughts, right?
That's me for sure. Like, I'm totally an internal processor. I don't really like to have a conversation until I've had a time to kind of go through it on my own first.
Yeah. And I'm the other way. I'm an external processor. I want to talk it through. So Mr. I want to talk it through, right? We're exactly the opposite. I think out loud, and often I don't necessarily understand what I'm saying. And sometimes Charlotte will call me on it. She's like, that doesn't make any sense. I'm like, oh, no, I'm
working through it.
I'm just spitballing here, which is so counterintuitive to an internal processor, right? So external processors, they want to work through it, and then they get a chance to say it out loud. But talking through it, or talking, is a way for them to process. Our youngest son is also an external processor. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, we were just talking this morning about how teaching him to drive. Talk about that. Like, how when you are taking him driving, how you just give him, how do you work with him on that?
Oh, well, so he's an external processor like me. So I know that he's just trying to talk because he's nervous. Mm-hmm. He's still learning how to drive, right? And so now I just give him things to talk about. I just tell him what I want him to talk about, you know, blind spots and traffic up ahead and brake lights and lane changes and all those types of things. And so he's externally processing. So the way I keep him engaged and also give him feedback is I let him externally process what he's seeing by just asking him the questions so that he can answer those.
Yeah. So if you're married to someone who is an external processor like Robert, then listening, even when they're just kind of talking in circles sometimes
Can be frustrating.
Can be frustrating for an internal processor. It's like, why didn't you think this through before you came to me with this? Right. Like, so even when they're talking in circles.
I'm sorry. I just remember how many times I'm talking through something. I'm like, that's a bad idea. Forget I said that.
Right.
Yeah. And you think I'm an idiot. Be like, you didn't think that through before you spit it out?
But again, it really is an act of love because for you, that is how you work through it.
Yeah.
And if by listening, I gave you an opportunity to work through it and to get to that conclusion because you need that sort of backstop to be able to talk things out with a person. So you're really not just hearing them. You're actually helping them to be able to think. You're giving them space to sort through whatever thoughts, whatever emotions, whatever it is that's going to bring them more clarity, as you just saw in Robert.
Yeah, fantastic. So why is it so hard to listen? Why is it so dang hard?
It is hard.
Yeah.
So I think our ego is huge, right? Our ego is a collection of stories we tell ourselves about who we are. And those stories really don't like to be challenged.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's easier, I guess, to cling to our self-deception than to confront these uncomfortable truths. But as we said earlier, you're really not fooling anybody.
No.
Your family's not fooled. Your spouse isn't fooled. Your kids aren't fooled. They see what it is that you don't see. So even though you don't really want those stories exposed, they already have been.
Yeah. So another challenge for
listening
would be a fear of change, right? So I don't want to hear you because I'm probably going to hear something about myself that I don't like.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then if I do love you and I do respect you, I'm likely going to have to act on that change, which is why it's so hard. Right. And so sometimes we fear that deep down that we're truly understanding our partner's perspective might require us to do something. Right. And then we don't necessarily want to change. And that feels threatening because we're creatures of habit. We're happy with how I drive the same way to work every day. I make the same right-hand turn.
Right.
You know,
predictability. It feels safe to be able to keep everything.
And now you're asking me to like, whoa, hang on. The world's changing because you've asked me to pick up my socks or something.
And listening is also hard because we lack self-regulation. You know, it tests our ability to stay emotionally grounded. When we hear something critical or upsetting, our adaptive child, our reactive, self-protective part of us
absolutely
wants to take over. And if we're not careful, of course, we default to those defensive patterns instead of being able to stay present. So that's a huge challenge to listening.
Yeah. Another challenge is the urge to fix, right? I mean, this definitely me, but maybe it's a guy thing. And I do remember a conversation we had one time when we were driving. I still remember exactly where we were. We were going over the railroad tracks and Charlotte was telling me something. I had to stop her. I'm like, hang on. Is there something I need to fix here? Or do you just need me to listen?
Just listen.
And you said, listen. And I was like, oh,
Thank
what a
goodness.
relief.
Yeah.
I don't have to look for what to fix.
Yeah.
I can just listen. I can be compassionate. Right.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we don't listen because we're looking for that thing to fix.
Yes.
Especially if we're, I don't know. I think everybody can do it, but I'm thinking highly motivated people like to solve problems right out of the gate. Mm-hmm. So for me, the faster I can solve problems, I actually like to do that.
Right.
Right. So you give me a problem solved. Like that's my favorite thing to do is say I solved the problem. Right. So we do it out of our good intention, but you know, it's not really what's needed. What's needed is we need to give them space, just be with the other person, let them share their experience and their feelings. And oftentimes through that, you'll create a much stronger bond.
Great. So another reason why listening is hard, I think, is fear of vulnerability.
Oh, right? Yeah. I don't want to share that.
I think in a good number of the couples that I work with, there's one of the two is usually like maybe a dismissive or avoidant attachment style. Mm-hmm. And so listening can be truly very difficult for someone. It can feel extremely overwhelming. And it's usually because of past experiences that they've had, maybe past traumas or micro traumas that have built up over time, maybe all the way back to their childhood. And so it's taught them that staying detached, staying avoidant is safer than actually coming out from behind their wall and being present
staying walled off. Absolutely.
And so it's very challenging for them because of their past history to be able to engage in a conversation where they have to listen like that.
So yes, listening is hard. It will challenge your ego, your patience, your emotional regulation, right? But this is a good thing. But because this kind of pressure is what forces us to grow. It's exactly what is needed for the marriage and the relationship.
That's right.
This is awesome.
Yeah. So listening well, one thing I want to point out real quick, and then we're going to get to some specifics of how to do this, but listening well doesn't mean you have to let everything in as truth.
Ooh, yeah. I have a quote about this.
I really want to touch on this because remember a few weeks ago, we talked about our internal boundary and which is the boundary to our psyche. And listening to someone well doesn't mean you have to absorb everything that they say. If this person, for example, if they're belittling or if they're contemptuous or they're super critical and they're mean, you don't have to take all of that in, right? That's where your internal boundary comes in. Your internal boundary is the boundary to your psyche. It's what helps you filter, is there truth here?
Yeah.
And sift through, even if it is a little bit contemptuous, it allows you to sift through what is true. And okay, I'll take that little piece in, but all of the rest of this, I'm going to keep out.
Yeah. I mean, let's go back to the F. Scott Fitzgerald quote that you mentioned early on.
Yes.
He said, be able to hold two separate ideas. Didn't say accept two separate ideas,
That's
right? So I can still compare these two things.
Right.
Without saying like, oh, I want this and I want that.
Right.
And then we're going to talk about a little bit more about that decision later. Right?
Yeah. Good point.
So, but if there is some truth to one of these ideas, then you can open up and let that truth in and internalize it and utilize it. Right. And this brings us to one of the key takeaways of this episode. The role of the listener is to listen and hear what is true.
Hear what is true.
Yeah.
So really all that goes into listening is this. First, you need to stay present, remain curious. You want to genuinely try to seek to understand this person who, as we've already established, is a reasonable person.
Right.
Right. And if you don't fully, like, to me, I almost imagine wearing this like hat of Robert, right? Unless I can fully see the world as though I'm Robert. If I don't fully understand his perspective, then of course I can continue to ask these clarifying questions.
Yep.
Not to counter his position, but to be able to grasp his position, right? And then, and here's the biggest takeaway Robert just said, can I then, as I'm doing all of this, scan for what is true? What is true here? What is true? What is true?
Yeah.
And
yeah, absolutely.
You have a story about that.
Yeah. You know, I saw this podcast in it, and I love saving these little quotes because I don't know. That's just how I work in my head. But so there's a story about Kat Cole. She's the CEO of AG1 with the Athletic Greens. She's been the CEO of a number of different companies. And, she had this great advice that was actually given to her. And she uses it when she talks about this interview. She says, this advice that I was given sort of has guided me in my decisions. So she says, whenever you're criticized, first assume that criticism is correct. And then one of two things will occur as a result. Either A, you will realize that there is some portion of that feedback that is valid, and you will act with humility necessary to both preserve the relationship and then act and improve on that thing.
Whatever that feedback was.
Mm-hmm. Or B, you can reflect on the thing, right? But you can't see anything that's valid. You're just like, well, you know, I accept this, but I don't really see anything is valid here, right? But at least I've reflected upon it. I've given it consideration, right? But in how you approach that criticism is focused on the why instead of debating the what, right? And thus you preserve the relationship in the process. And as she says, this guidance has carried me through my entire career when it comes to building teams and managing companies. And I just love that. It's the same thing. You know, you have these different ideas that are presented to you, especially when it comes to criticism. You can be open and mature enough to take it in if it's necessary, to say, like, what part of this is true? Do I own this? Should I own this? Act with humility. I love the way she says that. And then preserve the relationship. And then the other thing is, like, I appreciate you bringing that to me. I don't really see that. Is there another perspective that maybe would help, right? Continue to ask questions, continue to be curious.
So I love that. And that's perfect. And it goes back to what we said at the very beginning with that quote, like, can I hold these two ideas long enough? And sometimes I think when we're looking at what is true, maybe initially, like what I shared about you earlier, and when you gave me feedback and I'm like, there's just no way. He definitely is not seeing me correctly here.
Mm-hmm.
But as I continue to ask more questions, okay, there is an element of this that's true.
Yeah.
And sometimes we need to get more information. And sometimes we have to go to a trusted friend even. I remember a client one time I was working with and I gave her some feedback and she was like, that's absolutely not me. And she went and asked a trusted friend who would be honest with her. And she came back to me like 2 months later and she said, I asked a friend and she said, you're right, that I am doing XYZ. And I really didn't believe that that was me. So sometimes we have to either continue to get more information or go ask someone that we trust. But the point that Robert made with talking about Kat Cole here is that we need to be scanning for what is true. What is true? What is true? What is true? What is true? And I love the question we shared last week. What am I pretending to not know about this situation? What am I pretending not to know? Is there any truth that's actually here?
I love that. It's like, what part of this is do I own? I think in any question, any feedback, I think you just have to pause and shove that little 3-year-old back down in the box, right? Your little
adaptive child.
Like, nope, you can't come out. It's still the wise adult here who's going to make a decision. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say, you know what? Actually, some of this might ring true, probably because I've heard it before. Mm-hmm. And I will say, if you get feedback more than once and it's the same thing from more than one person,
probably want to look harder.
You probably want to look harder on that.
So let's just kind of put this all into perspective, considering the last 2 episodes. So in last week's episode, we talked about the 8 steps for the speaker.
Yep.
So let's just say that the speaker is your partner and they've just gone through the feedback wheel. They've just done the 8 steps and they've gotten to step 8, which is to invite you to now share your response. And once they have finished speaking and it's your turn to talk, what is it we do first?
Ooh.
The first thing, when you switch from being the listener to the speaker, the very first thing that you want to do is start by acknowledging everything that was true in what they said.
Yeah.
Which is the exact opposite of what everybody does.
No, everybody starts talking about things that aren't true so that they can like, oh, no, I didn't.
Which to me is just an indicator that you weren't really listening.
Yeah, absolutely.
The whole time, all you were doing was just making a checklist of all the things that weren't true so that you can refute them.
Yeah.
Right.
So right now that you're acknowledging things that are true that were said, right? This is critical because it shows that you're allowing yourself to be influenced by your partner's perspective, right? You're listening. Even if there's 10% or 50% of that was true, start with that. Start by saying, you know what? Like there's some things I can take from there. I need to own that. Right? Mm-hmm. So why, right? Because when we take responsibility for our crap, right, even the smallest part of the smallest contribution we had to the situation, our partner is far more likely, they're just going to calm down. They're going to feel heard.
Right.
They're going to feel respected. And if we don't do that, then we risk escalating the conflict and then just eroding trust. Like you weren't really listening, and then all that's going to spin out. And then the 2 3-year-olds are fighting over the.
Yeah. So I want to just reiterate one thing you just said there. Even if 90% of what they said was incorrect, like totally off the wall, and only 10% of it was right, it's still best to go back with the portion of what was true, even if it's 1%.
Yeah. Well, you're validating them and you're showing that you're listening.
Showing that you're listening.
Yeah. You're showing to listen. You're validating. You're like, you know what? I agree. There's parts of that where I need to own that. Wow. How refreshing is that?
Right. Completely different.
In any sort of conflict conversation.
So what does this actually sound like in real life? So we'll share a few phrases with you of what it sounds like when you're accepting influence and you're actually now switching from the listener and you're now starting to become the speaker. It might start out with, you know what? That's a fair point. Or, you know what? You're starting to convince me here.
Yeah. Or like, I agree with part of what you're saying and I agree with blank. Or, you know what? Oddly enough, I never really thought of it that way. I never realized how my actions might have, blank.
Right. Or you might say something like, I think your point of view is making sense as I'm kind of like seeing it through your eyes. I can see now a little bit how I was being whatever, selfish or inconsiderate or whatever. And so just lead in with those things again that are true. And then you're going to continue as the speaker doing exactly what we talked about last week. So then what would be next?
Yeah. then once you've fully acknowledged everything that was true and only then, right? Then you can ask to share your own perspective of the events, right? And at this point, you become the speaker. And then once again, you're going to follow the 8 steps that we outlined in last week's episode. And this process starts over. So you don't just get to jump in and start just hammering away. Same thing, the respect that was shown when the speaker took the 8 steps and you did the hard part, which was listening, right? You're going to take the same thing. You're going to take the 8 steps. The speaker now becomes a listener. And this is just this is going to keep the dialogue within the grownups.
And I do want to point out that as you become the speaker, if you need a few minutes to go and reflect before you come back to speaking, you can say, you ask for a break and go back and go through the 8 steps. I need to calm down. I need to self-confront. I need to consider what it is that I want to achieve here. I need to look at the facts. I need to tease apart my stories, right? I need to go maybe do that whole thing myself, because maybe initially when we first start doing this, we need that time in between to go work through it in the other room for a second.
Yeah. And when it seems like it takes a long time to do these things, but the more you practice this ability to be able to communicate one with another, the faster you're able to sort of move through those steps, and the faster you're able to kind of go backwards. You're talking, somebody gives you feedback and you're like, ooh, hang on, let me calm down for a second. Hang on, I'm going to take a deep breath. Let me center. Let me challenge my story. I'm going to think about this for a minute. Okay, I'm ready to talk about this again. Right? That didn't take very long to do that, but the more you do this, the more that you realize that the end result, what do I want to achieve? The end result is, this is a person I love.
Yeah.
This is a person I want to live my life with. Like, that's my goal. And if I can stay focused on the goal, then I can take whatever steps necessary.
Yeah, I love that. And it does feel robotic at first. I've had clients tell me, this feels so unnatural. And it does. It's because you're literally doing something. You're speaking a language you've never spoken. Of course, it's going to feel robotic and weird. But as you said, the more you practice it, the more it goes off script, but it still stays within I had a friend one time tell me, we were talking about something. He's an amazing piano player, very talented. And he said, you have to learn how to play it perfectly before you can learn to kind of go off script.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I feel like it's kind of the same idea here. You have to learn the gist of it, the pieces of it. And then after that, it can start to flow without necessarily following an exact script.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the whole point is that what you're gaining through this process is deep understanding. And here's what to remember. Understanding must precede any sort of resolution.
Yeah.
Before you can compromise, before you can come up with options, before you can negotiate, you both must really sufficiently be able to understand one another. You have to understand, because again, behind every conflict, there's always someone's dreams, someone's values that are someone's perspectives that just need to be incorporated into the solution.
And they just need to be heard.
And if once you can understand what those dreams and values are, then the compromise itself is actually quite easy.
Yeah.
Once I see what your dreams are, what my dreams are, what our values are here, once we really understand each other, then the compromise is not a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we just want it, again, eye on the goal. What do I want? This is someone I love, and it may be a little bit sucky, but we're going to get through it.
Yeah.
And when you approach problems in communication that way, instead of trying to be right, you're trying to find a win for both of you.
That's right.
Like, it gets a whole lot easier, right?
Yeah. So yes, listening is not always easy, but it is one of the most powerful ways to strengthen your relationship. So this week, challenge yourself to really listen, and remember, hold those 2 ideas simultaneously in your each hand, but always be scanning what is true, what is true, what is true, acknowledge it, and then just see how that will change your conversations this week.
Yeah. Thank you for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Remember, be kind to each other this week. Put each other first. It's the small things done often that make the greatest impact.
Until next time.